If then you were raised with Christ, seek what is above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Think of what is above, not what is on the earth. You have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. Today, of course, the greatest feast of the church year, we celebrate the resurrection of the Lord. When we speak of resurrection from the dead, we use that term, and the Bible does and the church does, in various ways. For example, we do not say that the resurrection of Jesus is the same as the resurrection of Lazarus. Lazarus was raised from the dead. The son of the widow of Nain was raised from the dead. The young girl was raised from the dead by our Lord. We have three accounts of Jesus raising individuals from the dead, but those individuals are not still here among us, are they? They died again. Jesus rose from the dead, and he cannot die again. Death has no power over him. He went to his death voluntarily, gave his life to save us, and then raised himself from the dead so as to provide us with the hope, the confidence, the truth that man is an integral being of body and soul. When we speak of resurrection from the dead, we speak of two sorts of resurrection then. One is a resurrection of the spirit. The other is the resurrection of the body. Spiritual death, the Lord had no part in. He is life. He identified himself as the resurrection and the life. So he did not need to be raised from spiritual death. But he gave himself to physical death, the separation of body and soul, and then he rose from the dead bodily. So the resurrection of the body is the resurrection that our Lord participated in. It's a sign of hope for us. But it's also a reminder that the human person was made by God as an integral being of body and soul. This reminds us then that our bodies are terribly important to us. They're not disposable. Unfortunately, many today, in cremating their bodies, give the impression that the human body is disposable, that we can treat it whatever way we wish. It's no longer needed. Even some have this idea that they don't want their body back. And this would be a contradiction to the faith. Now, not to say if you're cremated, there can be a good reason for being cremated, and there's no sin in being cremated in itself. But if one is doing so in order to rid themselves of their body, then yes, they sin. They sin against the Father, who is the architect of our human nature. He created us body and soul. Our body is not disposable. Our body is not to be thought of as something useless or merely a shell. And our Lord's resurrection is a sign of that truth. He rose from the dead. Would it not seem strange that the tomb was empty, our Lord ascends into heaven, body and soul, in his perfected human nature, and also Our Lady, who the church says uniquely in the Assumption, uniquely amongst the children of Adam, went into heaven was assumed into heaven, body and soul, perfected in her human nature. Wouldn't it be strange then if they were the only two, the new Adam and the new Eve, they were the only ones who were restored to their bodies? Of course, we desire to be in communion with them in the fullness of our human nature. And so this day gives us great hope and joy that our bodies will be restored to us, and better than even when God originally created Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall. We have an experience of human nature that is rather broken, but the promise is that we will be restored in our perfected human nature. So let us speak then, moving from the resurrection of the body to the resurrection of the spirit. Since the fall, every human person born has been born in a state of spiritual death, marked by original sin, destined for an eternity of horror. The Lord came to save us from that. He came to raise us up. And so we hear St. Paul say today, think of what is above, not of what is on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. What does St. Paul mean? We have died. The church speaks of baptism as both a death and a resurrection. We go down into the waters with Christ to die with him. And we come up out of those waters rejuvenated, revivified, living the life of Christ. The very life of God is poured into us in baptism. It's a true resurrection, a resurrection of the soul that was born in a state of death. And so these two things are very different then, the resurrection of the body and the resurrection of the soul. Christ's soul, of course, never died. He was always, in his human nature, eternally and permanently united to his divine nature. And so it was only his body that was to be resurrected, and that's what we celebrate today. But we also celebrate that his death and resurrection brought about the merits for our resurrection of body and soul. We relish this gift of the Lord, that he was willing to suffer so that we could be restored in our integral human nature. Now, this life that he gives us in baptism, this resurrected life, must be sustained in this life, because we still are subject to dying again, both bodily and spiritually. And so he says to us, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you have no life in you. We must receive the body and blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus in order to sustain the resurrected life that he gave to us in baptism. This is why when we approach the Eucharist, we have that faith of the church that says that what we receive is the very body of the Lord who cannot die again. And so what we receive is the resurrected flesh, his body, his blood, his soul, and his divinity in the Holy Eucharist. Like the women who encountered Jesus at the tomb but did not recognize him, neither do we when we encounter him in the Eucharist. It is not by sight that we know the resurrected one, but rather by faith. The Lord has guaranteed us this gift when he gave us baptism. He gave us faith to believe that what he told us is true, that he gives us his body and his blood, his soul and his divinity, in the resurrected flesh. Today, as we approach the altar, the resurrected one who was crucified comes down from heaven and offers himself to us. Let us recognize the one who loved us so that he would die for us, and then gives himself to us in his resurrection.